I'm looking forward to actually sharing with you today some insights and experiences that I have at applying play and games to serious health issues. So not serious games, but serious health issues. So what I'm going to talk about today is not games for wellness, not zombie run, but really serious issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we create digital medicine and the processes that we use as we're looking at kind of bringing together these worlds that Tusi actually talked about of entertainment into actual healthcare and real healthcare design. I'm going to go over a quick case study of the first ever US FDA approved digital therapy. This was approved in September of 2017 with a company that I and my colleague Walter Greenleaf helped to start in 2013 called Pear Therapeutics. And I'll talk a little bit about that and then how we actually bring these best practices and design to healthcare, and how do you change and shift when you're working in a regulated world? And these things really don't go together. They're really kind of, polar opposites of how we look at these worlds. So just getting into this, why would we apply play and games to serious health issues? For me, it's really, there's this increasing crisis of chronic behaviorally driven health issues. And the systems that we have to address these are not addressing it efficaciously. They're not addressing it effectively. It's not cost effective. And in a lot of cases, while there are great systems and therapeutics, they're not scalable and they're not working. A lot of mental and behavioral health issues can actually be seen and framed as learning disorders or maladaptive behavior, and we'll get into that. And so applying a lot of what Tusi talked about great learning dynamics can actually apply to healthcare. And that's why this is such an interesting opportunity to kind of bring these worlds together. Because of all these crises, one of the things that I've long advocated, and I've actually been an advocate for, applying games and game theory to learning for a long time, but digital therapies actually can apply, true medical value in this area. There's a huge unmet need, and I'm going to talk about this unmet need, again and again in my talk here today. The U.S. spends about $1.3 trillion a year on just CNS disorders. Up to 80% of the world market is either unserved or underserved, and I'll get a little bit more into why that is and what that looks like from a therapeutic perspective. There are few new drug therapies, especially in mental and behavioral health. And when I talk CNS, I'm talking psychiatry, neurology, and pain. And there's just a dearth in a CNS pipeline from a pharmacotherapy perspective. Kind of famously, last year, Pfizer decided to completely divest of its CNS franchises, right? So, huge pharma company saying, we're no longer in that space. We're just getting out. They decided it was not financially viable for them. There's been a number of things that have kind of driven a world of favorable reimbursement for these types of things, both as clinicians actually getting reimbursed for reading and interacting with digital therapies, as well as payers being willing to pay them. So here I have the Affordable Care Act. These are things coming out of the U.S. Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. And so regardless of whatever is happening in Washington or in Ottawa in Canada, one thing is certain is that the train has left the station for payers. Payers are really understanding that addressing these mental and behavioral health issues and addressing them early at the end of the day is highly beneficial to them. So regardless of what happens, it changes in Washington, like I said, or governmental changes, there is going to continue to be a favorable reimbursement for integrating and working within these healthcare systems, these digital therapies. And finally, and I'm going to talk a lot about data, and I know we've got some speakers who are speaking specifically about data and the power of data, but these software-based therapies have been shown to be efficacious. They've shown to work, and these are being brought through the same rigors of clinical trials, randomized controlled trials, that we would for a pharmacotherapy or a medical device. So being brought through the same systems, we're seeing as good or better outcomes with digital therapies. So what are we looking to address with our digital therapies and games in healthcare? There's a growing burden of noncommunicable diseases, and it's the fastest growing cause of death and disability around the world. And you know, the good news and the bad news of noncommunicable disease is that people are actually living longer with these, right? And so, you know, people will actually have these long-term chronic diseases that you know, are actually increasing the burden. The global cost burden, this is a WHO figure, is $47 trillion for these diseases. And there are very few efficacious therapies and treatments to address these. There's actually a decreasing life expectancy because of these. In the US, working class white men have actually seen a decrease in life expectancy because of behaviorally oriented diseases and non-communicable diseases. The other thing that's actually interesting about this, and I'm going to talk more about mental health because we've been focusing at Pear Therapeutics on the mental and behavioral health side, is that even viral disease can actually be rooted to behavioral causes. And the Reset therapeutic that I'll present today is for addiction management, substance use disorder, and opioid use disorder. And so there's clear ties between that behavior and viral diseases like Hep C and HIV. So when we look at the burdens here, they're just profound. In the CNS spectrum, you can see similar burdens, you know, trillions of dollars, and worldwide. So the 80% of the world market for mental and behavioral health is at 20% served in other parts of the world. So this is in our developed world here. We're only serving about 20% efficaciously. In other parts of the world, it's even more dire. On the subcontinent of India, there's kind of famously, if not infamously, for the billion people there, about 4,000 psychiatrists. Talk about a waiting line, right? You know, talk about a delay in services and need. And again, I'll talk about addiction. You know, there's a huge need here. The cost and consequences of mental illness and addiction are just phenomenal. And when we talk about disability-adjusted life years, if we add mental health disorders with our neurological conditions, we're looking at over 20% of cost burdens. And again, not a lot of scalable, affordable, viable, available therapies to be able to provide to people. But there are treatments, right? And in the real world, these treatments require expert framing and education, right? And this is where the e-learning and education part comes in. We actually frame a lot of these disorders as they require this kind of education. They require intensive coaching and attention to the patient. They can often require 24/7 access and support. And we see this again in addiction management where patients will be put in a 30-day treatment center where they're removed in this 24/7 access. Again, not viable or scalable for a lot of these things. A lot of the issues in the real world when we're trying to apply these therapies is that they're expensive. In San Francisco, where I'm from, the average cost of a therapist is around $200. In New York City, it's $300. It's not scalable. We can't all afford to have our own therapist sitting next to us and talking next to us. And the people who are actually in most need can least afford this. In no small part because there are all kinds of friction points that are incorporated and embedded into traditional delivery of healthcare. You know, if I need to go across town to see my therapist, I need to leave work early, I may need to get, you know, childcare, I may need to take 3 buses to get there or pay for an Uber. Finally, in the real world, there's a lack of specialists. You know, I talked about, you know, India and their 4,000 psychiatrists. In the United States, the American Pain Society suggests that there's one qualified pain clinician, one qualified pain medicine doctor for every 10,000 patients in need that has chronic pain. And so, you know, there's just a lack of skilled specialists in these areas. So what we're looking to address when we apply games and digital interventions to healthcare are really a couple different areas. And in the work that I'm doing, we really focus a lot on neuroplasticity. And I'll talk a little bit about, again, neuroplasticity. It can have a bit of a double-edged sword. It can actually cause people to have this maladaptive and learning disorder that causes them to kind of be down one path. But the beauty of neuroplasticity is we can change minds. And by changing minds, we can change brains and we can change lives. In our traditional world, the best approaches, the gold standard is, and you see we have a little couch-based system here where you're talking on the couch, spending a lot of couch time with your therapist. You may combine this with chemical agent, right? So consider like major depressive disorder. You've got your talk therapy, your SSRI or antidepressant, and that's the gold standard. Similarly with behavior modification, right? So we look at cognitive training, again, an education framework, activation that is actually really critical here is we're looking for activation. And this is the gold standard of care. And I want to talk a little bit here because I'm going to jump right into the games and how games apply here. But activation is actually really important and because actions can actually adjust neurochemistry. There's a couple of different theories from neuroscience. One is the facial formation theory. Are people familiar with facial formation therapy and theory? This is the theory that if you smile, and they've done tests with this, with just making people hold a pencil in their mouth so that their cheeks turn up, that you will actually report a better mood after this, right? So fake it till you make it. It works. It actually works. And it's actually interesting because our brains will actually adjust based on this. Not only our brains, our bodies. I work with a startup in San Francisco, actually originally out of Singapore, that has a blood pressure device. It uses cryotherapy on the carotid artery. And it naturally drops non-pharmacological intervention for high blood pressure, for hypertension, and it naturally drops the blood pressure after a therapeutic approach. After 6 weeks of this cryotherapy, their body just resets. So this plasticity actually works not only in the brain but in the body as well. So we know this works. There's great proof that this can work. And again, here's some of the proof. There's a number of trials. Actually, my colleague, Dr. Greenleaf, and I actually are just about to publish a book chapter in a medical textbook on digital therapeutics for chronic pain. We reviewed literally hundreds of studies that have been done over the years, going back over 20 years, looking at the efficacy of internet-driven therapies and games in healthcare, and I can tell you they work. What I have here is we're looking at internet interventions for depression and anxiety. I was talking with some colleagues over here earlier about applying this to kids. When we look at these digital natives, in Australia, our colleagues there found that using Sparks for teens with mild to moderate depression. This is a highly immersive and interactive game. They actually had greater improvements than treatment as usual. And this makes sense. These kids are digital natives. They know how to work in this environment. They're teenagers, so there's a little bit of a natural distrust of adults. But when they're engaging and interacting with their avatar, they just have better outcomes. And actually, this is interesting. Who's heard of NeuroRacer? Has anybody heard of NeuroRacer? Walter. NeuroRacer was a game that was developed by a colleague of ours, Adam Ghazali, at UCSF, and spun out to now a for-profit company called Akili. And NeuroRacer, when the studies came out, people were applauding. Obviously, it made the cover of Nature, but people were applauding that if this was a drug, it'd be $1 billion drug. The improvements in memory, attention, and cognitive function were profound with this. So these things are really exciting. We have a lot of venture investors excited about this, and I think a lot of medical professionals as well. So why games, though? Why and how does it work? We get patients actively involved, right? You know, when you consider like moving from novels to theater to film, right? One is a lean back, right? We've got these lean back systems, but games are lean in. You know, we get people involved in their therapy, in their experience, and they actually will spend more time in their own self-care. There's immediate and direct feedback, right? And for a lot of these things they're chronic and relapsing disorders, we need that kind of immediate feedback. Feedback is so pertinent here because our bodies are actually tuned to feedback. Right? And so if I'm trying to actually get somebody to modify their eating, and then, you know, I want to offer them, you know, what am I going to offer them? I'm going to offer you advice that the cookie is bad and the kale salad is good. But we know intuitively that the cookie is good, right? And it's got sugar and fat, and our bodies are actually tuned to that and tied to that. So that cookie offers an immediate reward and feedback that the kale really doesn't, right? That kale is going to be, you know, and you know it's good for you. But how can we actually layer on with a game system additional rewards that actually equate the cookie to the kale or even make the kale more rewarding, right? And so this is one of the things that games can do and give us. It can make it actually even more rewarding than the negative behavior that we're trying to replace. Increasingly motivating, and again, you know, and so with contingency management, this is like a reward system that I was talking about, and there's been a number of studies. We have colleagues at UConn in Connecticut on a group of over 26 PhD researchers that have been focusing on contingency management, led by Dr. Nancy Petrie there, for a number of years to see how these kinds of games and rewards can actually modify and motivate positive behavioral change. Games provide social connections. You know, we look at actually getting whole families involved, not only families, but, you know, what we call kind of weak social ties. And there's been some really interesting work done at MIT by Sandy Pentland and his human behavior lab looking at a concept called social physics. And in social physics, so in contingency management, if I do well and am abiding by and adhering to my therapy, I get a reward. You know, and this may be an intrinsic reward, an attaboy, a recognition, or it may be an extrinsic reward. I could get a Starbucks gift card, or, you know, out here, a Tim Hortons card, right? You know, where we get some rewards and physical. In social physics, we actually put together small groups that have related issues and concerns, and then we reward the group based on the group behavior and the group dynamic. So if the three of us were involved in a group and we all got rewarded for going for a run, I would make sure, and I got rewarded when you went for a run and you went for a run, I would make sure that you were going for your run every day. And you would actually be more highly motivated, right? We're much more likely to disappoint ourselves than to disappoint others. And so it's actually, you know, a really, really interesting. Sandy and his team actually have rolled this out in Brazil, in Africa, and trying to get people to immunize their children, right? And in those cases, the social physics suggests that, you know, if I bring my baby in to be immunized, I get a bag of beans, and when you bring your child in, I get a bag of rice. So I am walking you to that clinic so that I get that bag of rice as well. And I'm going to talk a lot about dose response when I get down into how we're actually modifying and moderating our games to make them more game-like, more efficacious. Because the more we interact with behavioral interventions, the better our outcomes, in large part, right? You know, it's diet and exercise. I can't just diet today. I need to diet for the rest of my life, right? So, you know, what we're looking here is how do we keep people engaged via this dosing? Again, going back to something Tusi talked about, games are important because we tap into these emotional drivers. In traditional healthcare, you know, we're largely motivating by logic and fear. And we know that this doesn't work. In 1859, Florence Nightingale said that, you know, apprehension and fear are the worst things for patients. They do a patient more harm than any exertion, right? So we've known this for a long time, and yet we haven't really effectively addressed how we tap into emotions when it comes to healthcare. And again, Tusi, you perfectly set me up. So, what we look to do in games is to bring in the emotional drivers from Hollywood, as well as Las Vegas. One of the things I like to say is Hollywood knows how to sway our emotions, and Las Vegas knows how to motivate us. Right? If you've ever gone to Las Vegas and you see these people pulling slot machines, you know that they've got some sort of power that the doctor doesn't. That we can get this kind of repetitive behavior going on and on and on. And this is what we're looking to kind of embed in our games. And the reason for this is that we are neurologically wired for story. And the reason that when I talk about games, it makes sense that Vegas is there, but why Hollywood? And it's exactly this. Research shows that when we convert facts into a story, we actually have improved retention. Right? Imagine I'm telling a patient that we need to lower your blood pressure by 20 points or 20% to hit this number because it'll increase your life expectancy by X. That is not memorable, right? But if I say, let's do this and here's how we're going to do it and moderate your behavior so that you can dance at your daughter's wedding, now all of a sudden this actually has greater meaning to me. It has greater impact in my life. Story actually enhances the meaning. It improves understanding, right? When we put things in these kind of story forms, people are much more engaged with what it is. And one of the things that we do as we're creating these digital health games is we look to see how every health concern can actually be applied as a story, right? So when we look at the hero's journey, where we have order and this is good health, and then there's a disruption of an inciting incident, right? And then this causes a chaos. So how do we look to apply this kind of this health as a order, chaos, and resolution that we can apply? And it actually works. And if I challenge anyone to think of a health issue that we can't apply this to. Because I think that we can kind of bootstrap it into just about everything. And when we do this, it actually works. Has anybody here heard of Remission from the Hope Labs? We got a couple of folks. So Hope Labs is a not-for-profit lab in San Francisco that's looking at applying game and game theory to health issues. It was founded by the founder of eBay's wife, Pam Amidyar, and this was the first game that they created, Remission. Remission was created for pediatric cancer patients. And the thing about peds and teens is they are a perfect storm for noncompliance, right? They see their treatment as a drag. This is just a drag. This is something that's taking me away from school and friends, the prom, the mall, right? They don't see this in any way of being helpful or advantageous to them that they're actually getting this type of treatment. With Remission, we actually see that there's a reframing of the story, right? We recreate the story of treatment here, where now we're going with Roxy, the nanobot, inside the body, where we are battling cancer with the weapons of chemotherapy and the body's natural response and all of the things that are in the treatment paradigm for these kids that they need to be adhering to, but that they're largely not. Interestingly, with this game, the game developers and designers designed 20 levels, and so this was intended to be 20 hours of play. But one of the things that they noticed is that the kids were just playing an hour, a couple hours, but we were still seeing improved outcomes. They were more adherent, and because they were more adherent to their therapies, they were actually having better outcomes with their cancer. And it's remarkable what's actually happened here, so that in subsequent versions, they decide, well, we don't really need this much. We just really need this kind of reframing of the story. And now they're actually even looking at, how long does it really take until there is the neurological shifts in the brain structures using functional MRI and PET imaging of what's happening in these kids' brains that they're enabled, that they've really just kind of shifted how they think about this. Before we get into we don't have time to create stories around this, it doesn't have to be Moby Dick or even Harry Potter, right? Context is storytelling. And so I want to just kind of point out here, this is Donkey Kong from 1981, and this is actually, the game mechanic, right? There's obstacles and a goal, right? But when we layer on even just the smallest type of contextual elements, we've got Kong here, that is our main nemesis. Actually, for anybody that remembers, that's Pauline. She was like one of the first female characters in video games. And so, we've got a love interest in Pauline, and we are here, Mario, kind of now going through the obstacles to get to our love interest. And so even though this is so simple, this is really Joseph Conrad in an 8-bit world. And so we can, as we're thinking about how, we layer on story here, it doesn't have to be super complex. We can just make contextual layers that drive those emotions. And here's another reason why games and digital therapies work. This is the world that we live in. And when we deliver therapies to patients via their devices, this is the modern day equivalent of a house call. Right? And a lot of these disorders that we're tackling in my work are these kind of chronic disorders, right? And, the crisis doesn't conveniently happen when I'm, sitting in the therapist's office or sitting in the doctor's office, and these systems are available 24/7. So what is it that we do when we create digital medicine? Number one, and again, I'm going to refer back to Tutsi's talk this morning, we have to understand our patients. And then, from my perspective, because I actually come from a game development and design and entertainment background perspective, I went to film school and then, got involved in creating digital medicine. We look at agile development and how we can apply that to the healthcare world. But starting with understanding our patients. I mentioned earlier that, a lot of traditional medicine really applies to the left brain, right? It's logic, and I'm a doctor, and this is the logical thing for you to do. And what we really want to do is to apply to both the left and the right brain, right? And this is where our emotional drivers and draw comes in. And one of the first things that we do is start to break down the psychographics. Right? And so I'm going to actually jump into a little bit more in depth with, what these kind of psychographics look like for healthcare patients. And then I'm going to run through a couple of examples of how I've done this for different therapies that I've worked on or am working on. So C2B Solutions has actually done this great work, these kind of longitudinal and long-term studies on what are the drivers and psychographics for patients, right? And interestingly here, it's a fairly even divide. It's about 40-40 with a lot of people being in the middle. One of the things that I want to point out about this, though, is that these are not fixed. Right? Patients don't, start off in one area and just have to absolutely stay there. That can happen, but we're largely mobile in this, in these psychographics, right? So one of the things I want to point out is most of us, when we were like in uni, high school uni, you're strong survivors. There's more important things. You're not worried about your health, right? You're too fierce for that. I remember myself feeling like I was bulletproof when I was an undergrad, right? You just aren't worried about anything. And then you can move. A key inflection point that is really notable for a lot of folks in moving it through these psychographics is the first time a woman gets pregnant. She may actually even jump into this kind of self-achiever phase where all of a sudden she's, now, really taking additional responsibility for her life. And one of the reasons that I want to point out that these are mobile psychographics, right, that we can actually move from one category to another is that a lot of times in our games we try to incite this movement. Right? I can take people who are strong survivors and active listeners and try and move them in a little bit more of a proactive category. But it's just the most important thing is to understand where your patients are coming from. So in this process, we do a breakdown of what are their motivators, right? And so when I look at my proactive, I look at what her motivators are, the business indications, because I'm in a for-profit business, right? We want to know how we're actually going to be able to monetize these people as well. Is this a direct-to-consumer play? Will they pay for this themselves? Is this something where, we need to find somebody else to pay? What do they look for, right? And then, of course, who are they? And then once we actually even have this, we get into a little bit more of an identity customer that goes into deeper and deeper about this person's life. And the same for our reactive target, right? And as I said, one of the things that we can consider, and I'm working on a project right now with the Mental Health Association of Maryland, where we're really actively looking at how do we get people who are reactive to become proactive. And so it's important for us to really begin to understand both of these areas, right? And how they're different and how they're the same. And again, looking at what this identity customer is looking like. In a more real-world example, this is the psychographics that I created for a game, a VR-based game with biofeedback that we created for chronic pain patients. These patients were on Medicaid, so government-only insurance and assistance. And they were on average, 65% women. And you can see here when we're looking at their motivators, these are largely needs-driven folks. And because they're on Medicaid, we certainly understand a lot about their socioeconomic levels, right? The levels at which they're coming from, their average education levels and the like. And then as we begin to kind of delve down into this is the first part of game design for us. Game design for health is really understanding these folks. We want to get into, who are our identity customers here, right? And what are their lives look like, right? So we can begin to really understand, their motivations, the friction points, right? And so when we look at Larissa, we have Larissa here as a picture with her kids. She's a single mom. She suffers from back pain. She's got a lot of going on in her world, and she's got a lot of issues. And so, one of the things that we want to consider when we're creating all of these games is, what are her needs? Similarly with Nancy, we want to look at, how she's the same and different from Larissa as we're crafting this game, and the same for Jose. We're looking at, how can we create something that's actually going to appeal and to apply to all of these folks. And we create this in-depth backstory. So as we're designing these games, we know these people, right? We can refer to, well, Jose won't really like that. And what can we do for Nancy in this case? And, this language doesn't really appeal to Larissa, and we may need to make some adjustments there. So they become characters in our world as game designers and developers as we're developing these therapies. So this is really the beginning of the process, right? So we need to first understand our patients, their needs, and the desired outcomes. And one of the things I want to say about the desired outcomes, too, is that we really want to marry the desired outcomes, our clinical desires and outcomes, right? I want you to lower your blood pressure, like in the case of our chronic pain patients. These chronic pain patients were being seen frequently, and they were high opioid users, right? So we wanted to decrease hospital and clinic visits, and we wanted to see if we couldn't also decrease opioid use amongst these patients. So these are two clear and readily, objective measures, clinical outcome measures that we're looking to measure with this game, right? And then what are Nancy, Larissa, and Jose's objectives? Well, they want to be pain-free. They don't really care about decreasing their opioids. Their desire is to be pain-free, right? And so how do we kind of marry these desired outcomes with the patient's desired outcomes as well as clinically our desired outcomes? And then the rest of this looks like, kind of more traditional game design, right? Once we understand our patients and the kind of possibly even conflicting desired outcomes that we have as clinicians versus patients, we create a game concept. The game design, and then this is a lot of what we do. But for us here, after data, we measure these health outcomes. We measure it both from a perspective of a net promoter value from the game user perspective, right? Do you like the game? Did you engage with it? Would you recommend it to others? Do you feel that as a patient that this has improved your life and your etiology, your condition, as well as from a clinical perspective, right? In the case of our chronic pain game, did it decrease clinic use and visits, and did it decrease opioid prescriptions? So it layers on more complexity into what we're doing here. The challenges here as we're moving into a regulated environment, and I'm going to jump really quickly here into what we did at Pear Therapeutics, is this is a traditional clinical process, product design process. This is really kind of for pharmacotherapy. Tusi again kind of talked about this. This is waterfall, right? This is like anathema to us as game designers because, this is, with a lot of planning, a lot of pedantic, feedback loops and response, whereas, our process in Agile is just to constantly build, design, release, build, design, release, build, design, release, right? So these worlds are kind of not congruous, very incongruous, as a matter of fact. But it can be done, and that's one of the things that we've been able to achieve, and I've got other colleagues that are looking to do the same because it's necessary. And one of the reasons that it is necessary is digital medicine, digital health has been through this just outrageous kind of hype cycle. I was at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference in San Francisco in January, and I was talking about the power of regulated health. And I said there, in the app stores alone, not including health games that are on the internet, there were 320,000 health games available in the app stores. And somebody from the audience yelled out, 325. So between the time I had looked it up and got there that morning, there were like another 5,000 apps that had been added. And so one of the things that actually makes it really pertinent for us to be in this regulated environment, to be data-driven, is this hype cycle, right? I mean, we've seen, Thanos and the Mylan EpiPens and, a lot of things that have actually had a ton of promise, but that have just, not really been shown to work. And I think in this next generation, we need to be just data-driven. We need to actually prove that these things work. We need to have the same type of rigor that is applied to pharmacology and medical device. And so we're working in the United States with our FDA, but across the world, in Europe, and I know here there are similar regulating bodies. We actually approach this differently too, So in that first kind of hype cycle that I talked about, when Google was getting involved in these early days, they basically kind of even said, oh, we don't need to be regulated, we're going to innovate, and they came smack dab against this, these regulating bodies. But we took a different approach. We said that these regulating bodies are actually here for a reason, right? They're here to weed out worthless cures, right? And of these 325,000 apps that are out there, how many of them really are just digital snake oil? And so what we need to do as clinicians and game designers in this space is differentiate between that digital snake oil and work within these systems so that we're actually integrating into the clinical workflows. So in our RESET case study, let me tell you just a little bit about Pear Therapeutics. I mentioned Pear earlier. We're a digitally integrated digital therapeutics company. We, in 2017, had the first FDA-approved digital therapy, which is RESET, that I'm going to be presenting. We started the company by launching a subclinical app and platform in 2015. And then we decided that we really needed and wanted to go only into this regulated space. So when you look at our pipeline, we're really addressing areas of high unmet medical need and really, serious health issues, right? So beyond our substance use disorder and opioid disorder, we have therapies for schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress, generalized anxiety disorder, traumatic brain injury, insomnia. So we started with addiction, though, because this is in the United States, a nationwide epidemic. And I know I've got just a little bit more time here, so I'm going to run through some of these things. In 2016, 65,000 people died of a drug overdose. That's like 2 jumbo jets crash landing every week and killing everyone on board. And still in many areas, there's a horrible lack of care and services, even for people who want help with their disease, right? So this is a huge and pressing need around the world. The current state of care often actually has diagnosis occurring way too late. And actually one of the things I like to talk about with addiction is, we wait for somebody to be either arrested or overdosed in a hospital before we actually say something. That's like waiting for somebody to weigh 500 pounds before suggesting they go on a diet. And we need to actually get to them sooner. And there's inconsistent treatment. And I talked about, the dearth of treatment for a lot of these things. By some accounts, only 1 in 10 patients with an addiction disorder actually gets appropriate treatment. 10% of patients that have these disorders. And we approach it as a learning disorder, right? Addiction actually has roots in the word enslaved. And this is where we were talking a little bit about this neuroplasticity and the neuro effects of this, right, as a learning disorder. These patients become tied and keyed to the reward system that the drug or the alcohol provides for them. And while they realize and understand the negative impacts, their neurochemistry is just tied to that reward system. And so our success requires actually reframing that reward system. So I'm just going to run through this really quickly because I realize I'm running out of time. The reset is actually based, it is integrated into clinical workflows. There are a number of patient-facing modules. And one thing I want to note here, too, is as we're applying this and approaching the FDA with this, our clinical trials were based on some work that came out of Dartmouth Geisel School of Innovation Medicine. And the FDA wanted to see things that were really close to the exact trial data, right? And didn't give us a lot of room to innovate. And I want to make sure I have an opportunity to talk about game innovation and how we apply this. But a couple quick points here. So when we look at this looks more like an app, right? This isn't really game. Okay, this is a game. That's like a little roulette wheel where you spin the wheel. And this is kind of gamification. And it works, right? And this works. And I have to say, and just kind of pointing out here, this actually integrates with clinician dashboards. This is a prescription-based therapy. So the clinician actually, and there are CPT codes. Those are billing codes. So docs can actually bill against utilizing this and working with this because, in the US, we're moving towards capitation, but we're still in, and accountable care, but we're still in a fee-for-service model. So we're going hand in hand with both of these. So, the docs can actually work with this. They can trace and track their patients. They can triage their patients with this. And our outcomes actually prove. Now, these are chronic and relapsing diseases. I don't want to say that this is a cure, but in our 12-week studies, patients that used reset versus treatment as usual had a 2x improvement. This is all comers, 2x improvement over treatment as usual. And treatment as usual in this case was 3 times a week with a therapist and providing actually the same therapy, which is community reinforcement approach, a flavor of cognitive behavioral therapy specifically developed for addiction disorder. I want to point out here that for the most reticent patients, these are patients that showed up on study start still high. They had a positive urine tox screen. When they started the study, we had a 10x improvement over treatment as usual. And the retention numbers and the p-values here for any of our stats wonks are phenomenal. We're just so pleased and proud of what we've been able to prove with this, right? And I mentioned earlier, data-driven, and data, focused. And this actually does actually create medical value, right? There are cost savings, there are values that we can attribute to getting these patients improved and healthier sooner. And we did the whole process of submitting this to the FDA, and I don't know if anybody's ever submitted anything to the FDA, but writing a de novo 510K for the US FDA was, this is the e-file, I have to say. For e-filing, they made us print it and send it in. I think it weighed like 28 pounds. So when we're looking to, and I mentioned here that we have enhanced outcomes not only for the patients, clinicians, but as well as the payers. Just really quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, I want to talk really about how we're looking to gamify and even enhance this. So when we're looking at this process and then you whomp on a 26-page document, the FDA really has not been tuned and keyed towards a lot of rapid change, right? The drug Lipitor has been on the market for 30 years and they haven't changed the formulary, right? So this is not that, for good reason, right? I mean, we can't actually stay in those worlds because we're in technology. And for one reason, the earth moves under our feet, right? If you've got an Android device, it wants to update all the time. My iOS device updates on a regular basis. By changing, we can also enhance personalization. This goes to actually scaling and reusing content, right? Via reskinning it, I can actually make something that, highly appropriate using cognitive behavioral therapy for one group versus another by dynamic reskinning and personalization. And I also mentioned this dose response, right? And so we want to enhance these games to make them more engaging and sticky for our patients. So how we do that is we focus on the data. We also don't make claims, as we're making changes. We run these things through, and then we run them through the control trials that are most pertinent. And for us, we work with our agencies that will help to kind of fund these things. So in our next version of Reset, we did some agile storyboards where we decided that what we're really looking at is Grand Theft Auto meets The Sims, right? And we wanted to create a really engaging and immersive world that, brought to life this issue, this story arc, that, where we can reframe one story with craft. This is the community reinforcement approach. And so what we went from is an app looking to much more game, and I'm just going to run through some of these screens where you can see. So, from an app world, we've now got, options and outcomes. This is, a highly immersive game world where we're looking at a holistic approach to our patients' needs and drivers and all of those emotional tugs that I was talking about earlier. So, as opposed to just, now text on a screen, we've got, somebody actually entering a bar, right? And talk about refusal skills coming to life, And so we're really looking to kind of bring this very much to life here. And to have these types of identity and engagement exchanges that make this all the more real for our patients. And I apologize for having to kind of run through that really quickly. I know that we'll have a panel discussion later, and I will certainly be around to answer any questions.